Welcome, friends. Today, I'm going to speak one final time about the imminent decline of the American empire. And you may wonder why I spend so much time talking about geopolitics. But something that's very important to understand is that politics are essentially a distillation of human nature. The fact of the matter is that through politics, we magnify some of the worst human tendencies that there are. En masse, then we tend to bring the worst out of each other. It is also the case that we can bring out the best of each other. But on a political scale, on a national scale, then the tendency is for the lowest common denominator to prevail. And I think this has something to do with our strong tendencies towards tribalism and the herd mentality. Also, we're a little bit like lemmings, and people get overexcited, and the consequences aren't very good, especially when the individual feels like they have something to lose. I mean, there are noble beings amongst us, and they can inspire us, but sadly, when they are no longer present, we tend to fall back into our old, despicable ways. So, as you may have heard, as I've stated in previous videos, then there's various indicators of the decline in empire. The most important thing to understand right from the beginning is that nothing is permanent. And one of the problems that faces an empire is this tendency to believe that that empire will continue in perpetuity. So, for example, the Nazis believed that they were going to create a Third Reich that would last for 1,000 years. Also, I think the Romans couldn't imagine a time when they were no longer preeminent in the world. The empire had lasted for so long. But thinking that we can keep things the same, or that things will not change, then we tend to do that which only accelerates our downfall. In general, as it's taught in the Buddha Dharma, that any time you work against nature, the natural state of things, and in this case that means emptiness and impermanence, then you only exacerbate the situation. Now, the first indicator of the decline of empire is traditionally seen to be Imperial overreach or military overextension. And this also highlights a very negative human tendency, something that we all do on a very subtle level, and it becomes amplified when we are a large group. And so when a society, a nation comes to preeminence, in other words, they overcome their enemies, and for a short period of time, then they have supremacy over others, and what we tend to do is use our power to expand. And we do so by basically robbing the resources of others. And this is the case. I mean, you just have to look what's happened in Israel, for example. They've had an advantage in that they've been provided some very sophisticated weaponry over decades. And because they believe they're untouchable, then they will dare to do things that other nations would never do. And this is always the case. It was the case in the Roman Empire, it was the case in the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and also in the American Empire. And so in America, for example, then they've been involving themselves in the politics in other nations for decades. And you could say probably for a century or so, because as the Spanish Empire started to decline, then America started to absorb some of its territories. What we've learned in more recent times is that forcing coups and regime change seldom works out. And really all we've done is we've created a very destabilized continent. The South American continent has been destabilized intentionally by the Americans, by the CIA, for decades over decades. And then now we complain because there's lots of immigrants, there's lots of refugees, for example. But we're complicit in this. You know, it's foolish to think that we are separate from this or that we're not responsible for this. In fact, as I've stated before, then Europeans are the most prominent agents of migration in human history. So an empire comes to preeminence, they gain supremacy over others, and they use their might then to bully smaller countries. And because of this, then the empire expands. And expansion initially is a good thing because it means you gain more resources. But at the same time, your borders increase. And so, for example, for America, they spend nearly $1 trillion and in their budget on the military. At the same time, they're still spread very thinly. And what it reminds me of is Hadrian's Wall on the border of England and Scotland. This is something that was built very much later on in the Roman Empire. And it was when the Roman Empire itself was becoming more and more fragile. That's because their borders had become so massive, there was kind of no limit to the empire. And this is when they'd overreached, they've overexpanded, sort of like a balloon or a bubble. Eventually it has to burst. And so America's been doing this, like I say, for a century. And more recently than we remember, Vietnam War, Afghanistan, and Iraq, for example. These things are over expensive. It means we have to invest our resources and also our manpower abroad. And this is very expensive. So this imperial overreach, this tendency to use our advantage, our physical advantage, to bully others, to abuse them, also comes at a cost. And it's very, very expensive. This is part of the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, for example. It was the case for all empires that have failed. And so this leads to the second point about the collapse of an empire, and that is currency debasement. So in the case of Spain, if we take that as an example, then they discovered some territories in the New World. There was just a bunch of kind of indigenous people there. And so what they did was they used their advantage, their military advantage, to mistreat the indigenous people and steal their resources. And so for a short time then, Spain had lots and lots of money. It owned the majority of the gold and the silver in the world. And of course, what do they do with this? Then they build armies, all the noblemen built big fancy galleons, put lots of soldiers on them. They all have to be fed, and they went around conquering other countries. It's this human stupidity, right? We gain some advantage, and then we resort to our worst instincts, and that is what we think is easier, right? If I'm big and you're little, and I punch you in the nose, then I benefit from that, and it's almost costless to me. That's not the way things work, though. Especially if you're a Buddhist and you have to believe in karma, cause, and effect. For example, if we go around in other countries punching people in the nose, then decades later they might come along and pay us back. And that's kind of what's happening, right? So these ventures, these military ventures, these expeditions are very expensive. And then once you've expanded, you have to protect your new territories. That's also very expensive. And so it leads to currency debasement. And the Spanish initially, they conquered all the gold mines in Central America and South America, etc. And it made them very rich. And then they spent that money on their military, building fancy castles, on vanity projects, etc. And then eventually their mines dried up, obviously. And so their economy started to deplete. And also they had huge expenses. It was the same for the British Empire. They had massive expenses. And so what the Spanish did is they started adding copper into the coins. Coins were originally silver or gold, and they started adding copper into it. So it's devaluing the money. And what we've done in the West is we've printed more money. So for example, in the case of the United States of America, since 1971, then about 98% of the purchasing power of the dollar has reduced since 1971. So that's a massive shift. And this puts additional strain on the empire. And like I say, we make it worse. We make it worse by overexpanding. And so on these first 2 points, then you could see what Donald Trump's been doing is only accelerating the demise of the American empire. If somebody was smart and they knew they were in decline, then they would do what's called a managed decline. And if an empire was really smart, then from the outset, they wouldn't invest all their money and effort into dominating others, abusing and bullying others, because it's very costly and eventually it will cause the fail of the empire. But in general, we're not that intelligent, and also we don't have a kind of far-reaching view. We also don't listen to experts. We kind of act out on our instincts. Currently, what's Donald Trump doing? Well, he's sending his fleets to Venezuela or to the Middle East, right? Increasing his presence abroad. This is more costly. And again, this will only accelerate the demise. Because of that, then it's accelerating this currency debasement. This leads to what's called a debt spiral. And we're all aware of this. There's different figures given, but the one I could see is that currently America's $38 trillion in debt. Absolutely insane amount of debt. And so what's the current administration doing? Well, in the last 2 Trump terms, he's added about 10 trillion more onto that debt. So you can see here it's only exacerbating the situation. And he's got all kinds of plans of stuff he wants to spend money on. It probably costs millions of dollars a day to keep the fleet near Venezuela, etc. Overall, it's probably not going to be a profitable thing. And part of this debt spiral for example, the United States of America and for the Soviet Union was funding wars. And for America, a big contributing factor was funding the Afghan and Iraqi wars. Very, very costly. In fact, this is what brought an end to the British Empire. They were the largest empire ever in human history, but they had a lot of expenses because they expanded all over the world and they had colonies everywhere. But in the end, it was funding war that brought them down because they had 2 world wars. And in order to fight these wars, or they made the decision to fight the war, and once they did that, they had to pay for it, then they had to borrow a lot of money. And in the end, it got to the point where they could no longer pay their debt. And this, in turn, causes other nations to lose respect for you. So you lose your prominence because you're no longer able to pay your debts. And so this psychological factor is really important. And we can see here that America right now is doing everything it can to make the situation worse. Because obviously, Trump's going a bit crazy with the spending. He's added a lot onto the debt, but also he's alienating his allies. So the idea is like you impose tariffs and then that will bring more money in. But really it's the American people have to pay that. And so they just become poorer. Everything becomes more expensive for them. It contributes to other problems, other consequences that will increase or accelerate the decline of the empire. And so by bullying their neighbors economically, imposing tariffs, then now these once allies are looking for other or new trade agreements with other nations. This is an example for Canada. Recently, Mark Carney traveled to China and negotiated a $1 trillion deal, including the import of Chinese vehicles. These are vehicles that otherwise could have come from the United States of America. And so by doing this, again, what he's doing is accelerating America's demise. But it's not like he's the only one who's ever done this. It seems that all empires do this. So along with this increase in debt and also the increase in costs for the people of that country, then manufacturing starts to collapse. And this has been happening in the United States of America. More recently then, between 2001 and 2009, 1/3 of manufacturing in the States has been lost. That's a huge amount. And it's unlikely that it will come back. And again, the current strategy is to increase tariffs. The logic being, if you tariff other countries, then they won't manufacture so much and you can manufacture more. But really, it's going to make things more expensive in the United States of America. So who would want to manufacture cars in the United States of America if all the parts are going to be more expensive? So the logic kind of falls down. So with so many manufacturing jobs lost, a shrinking economy, one thing exacerbates the next. And as I said in previous videos, then what an empire tends to do is as these other forms of decline start to happen, manufacturing loss, currency becomes devaluated, the debt begins to spiral, what they do is they use what they have. For some reason, the foolish emperors look around and think, well, we've got lots of soldiers, maybe we can use them to better the situation. That's the kind of calculus the Japanese made, right? And it was absolutely disastrous for them. And it was the same for the Spaniards. They had spent a lot of money and they built these huge, elegant galleons. And at some point they thought they would go and send the Armada to Britain. It was a big mistake. They just assumed that they would win. They're kind of puffed up with pride. This notion that we're the biggest nation in the world, we're the biggest empire, everybody has to do what we say, leads us to make very poor decisions about the future. And as we can see, that's what America's doing right now. They're trying to bully everyone in the world, but they've already lost a lot of standing on the world stage. And so people don't really take them that seriously. It's still a huge threat, but people will start looking elsewhere. The idea is if we bully them, then they'll be forced to build factories in the States, but it's unlikely to happen. They'll just turn to other nations for deals and try to figure out other ways. And famously in Carney's recent speech, then he said the old order is gone. It was never that good, but it's gone now. There's no point in mourning it. We have to deal with the new reality. and be honest about that. And I think most people in Europe, for example, are aware of this. So along with this kind of economic decline, manufacturing collapsing, the debt increasing, we've got things like this cost of living crisis. Then along with that comes this next important point, which is social decay. And this is a huge problem in the United States of America. For example, as far back as the 60s and 70s, they noticed this trend for Americans to become less educated. And they were predicting that this would be have really negative consequences in the future. And one of these potential consequences is the fact that the average earnings started to decline in the States in the next few decades. This is especially for people who are uneducated. So you can see if you've got more uneducated people, then they'll be able to generate less income. And then this leads to people being dissatisfied. And this problem increased. And there was a strange statistic around 1999, but around the millennium, when suddenly the mortality rate in the States started to increase. And that's a really bad sign. And it was mostly within kind of midlife age group, within sort of middle-age group, where a lot of these deaths are associated with what's called a death of despair. So it's not necessarily suicide, but for example, people were drinking themselves to death. And part of this social decay, for example, is this opioid epidemic in the United States of America. And we kind of try to look towards South America and blame it on corrupt politicians, etc., and cartels. But the truth is that Americans are increasingly looking for a way out. And it's a sign of a decline in their mental health and well-being and contentment. People no longer feel satisfied, and they have a sort of dystopic view of the world. And this is really important because now we are accelerating this exponentially, and the government is doing that. Again, they're trying to strong-arm everybody, but their tactics are only causing people to lose even more faith in institutions. And of course, this is only making people less happy. So the next factor in the decline of empire is loss of reserve status and currency. So generally, like an empire will have the most important money and everybody will want to use that. In the past, it was Spain. When Spain captured all the wealth from Central America, etc., in gold and silver, then Spanish currency became sort of the standard for the world. It was the same for Britain. And Britain only lost this after maybe World War I or World War II. And so this is also happening in the States. Now, the BRICS thing at the moment isn't such a big problem. It's kind of a fantasy, but it shows that nations are looking elsewhere. People are looking elsewhere for a world currency standard. But at the moment, the American dollar is still pretty standard in the world. But people are starting to have second thoughts. And they're also starting to doubt the stability of the American economy. And again, the institutions are only making this worse, right? If you fire all the sort of adjudicators and all the people who are supposed to be independent and give valid statistics about the economy and how things are doing, then people will lose faith and trust, and that's exactly what's happening. Now, not all empires collapse. For example, the Spanish Empire didn't totally collapse, and the British Empire didn't totally collapse. The Soviet Union did, however, and that's quite a drastic situation. And it's not certain that the American Empire will collapse, but the way they're going at the moment, it seems like they're almost trying to force this collapse to happen. That's quite a scary thought, because there's some influential people in the United States of America who would quite like to see this. For example, those who follow the philosophy of Curtis Yarvin, I've spoken about this in the past, something called dark enlightenment. They have this idea that if everything collapses, then the tech giants and the oligarchs can swoop in, the manufacturers can swoop in and take over, and we can have a kind of corporate-run government. That's their view of the future. Unlikely to work. I mean, eventually, the US dollar will no longer be the world currency. That's just inevitable, right? That's just got to happen. Nothing is permanent. Things change. Whether America finally collapses is not certain. But this point about social decay is really important. Because right now, what is happening is that the administration, by trying to strong-arm everybody, by never backing down, only ever doubling down, what they're doing is they're losing even more confidence from the people. And this is really important. You can only oppress people so much before they rebel, before they fight back. And hats off to the people in Minnesota, because they've got a really good way of thinking. I think this is a perfect example of when we bring out the best in each other rather than bring out the worst in each other. But anyway, what happened in the Soviet Union is that people no longer trusted the centralized government. They lost their credibility. And so regional ethnic groups started to rebel. And this really contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, the economy was a big issue, but it's all interrelated. So now, as we know, then Vladimir Putin has this idea that what he's going to do is he's going to rebuild the Soviet Union. And in general, this happens, I think, in empires as they start to decline. As a nation, they become very arrogant. They start to believe that they are the most important people in the world, the most powerful people in the world, and also that this situation would never change. And so they develop an intense level of pride and arrogance. Part of the reason why they're at war with Ukraine is because they need to fulfill this narrative that somehow they're still strong. But it's backfired, right? You can see that. That's only increased the speed of the decline of their nation. Because they were supposed to be the second most powerful military in the world, and they're taking on this tiny country, and it's destroying them. So it's not going well. In fact, this was part of the thing that caused them to collapse in the first place, because they went to Afghanistan, they spent many years there, and it didn't turn out well. They basically lost, similar to what happened to America and Vietnam. In the end, they lost, and they spent like however many billions of dollars to do this. And so in order to fulfill his narrative, then Vladimir Putin, for example, has to have kind of an iron fist to control his people. And part of what he did, and this started in 2016, was to try to create his own personal paramilitary or military force. And so what he did was he took lots of different elements from other branches of armed forces, armed services. So they're not necessarily military. For example, riot police, rapid response units, and border control. And he kind of agglomerated them all into one body, which he calls Rosguardia, and they're answerable to him. And now what he does is he uses this force to suppress his own people, to tighten his grip on the nation. And slowly, it doesn't happen immediately or overnight, then slowly, he's been tightening his grip on the people. It's not like he started off on day one poisoning people and killing and assassinating people like Navalny, etc. It was a slow process. And as far as I can see, the same thing's happening in the United States of America right now. In fact, I would guess, that Donald Trump has seen what Vladimir Putin has done. And he thinks it's a good idea. So he's taken the border guard and immigration control, and he's kind of filled it full of people who are radicalized. And he's using it like a private army. And he's trying to tighten his grip on the people. And this will only increase the social decay because people will become less trusting of the government. So there's one important element of a decline in an empire. And on the other side, then to his base that he's feeding all this raw meat to, sort of bragging about killing American citizens, etc., then to his base, they're projecting this image like, we're the most powerful nation in the world. Nobody can stand up to us. If you don't do what I say, you'll see what'll happen. This is exactly what the Japanese did. They were in a difficult position. They were losing their access to resources, especially oil. And so they sold this narrative to the people. We're the most powerful nation in the world. We're the superior race, just like the Germans did. And then keyed them up for violence and warfare. And through that, what they did was they destroyed their nation. And not only that, if you think you're supreme in the world, then it's unlikely you're going to apply yourself to your future betterment. I think there's something in China they call 996. People work from 9 till 9, 6 days a week. And they are working hard, and they're innovating. They've got a thirst and a hunger for advancement. But if you're in the States and you think, we're the most important, we're the most powerful nation in the world, nobody can defeat us, then you're going to sit on your ass watching TV and eating Cheetos, right? Along with that, take the fact that there's basic social decline in the States. People are less educated, they're less healthy, they've got less money, they're disgruntled, they're complaining, protesting. These are all the signs. And like I said before, you can't stop the decline of empire. everything is impermanent, but you can make the ride a little less bumpy on the way down. And certainly what you don't want to do is just accelerate that decline or push that decline into collapse. And in terms of the Buddha Dharma, then what will make the future better is whether or not you are under the grip of your negative emotions, pride, ignorance, jealousy, desire, anger, resentment, these sorts of things. And also, if you're one of those people who thinks that everything's going great, and actually what you need is a heavy hand and a bit of authoritarianism, then you should just look at other examples of how this turns out. I mean, the obvious one is Nazi Germany. For example, the oligarchs or the industrialists, they supported Hitler because there was a lot of economic pressures at the time. Their empire was collapsing. They had a bad outcome in World War I. And they thought, well, if we support this hard man, this strong man, then he'll work for our benefit and we'll get rich. Well, the industry did thrive after that, but they ended up just making tanks and warplanes. And we know what the outcome was. The entire country was decimated, destroyed. The same for Japan. They built a huge army. They had a strong leader. They had a strong military. They conquered half the world. In the end, they had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on their heads. They lost millions and millions of soldiers. It didn't work out. And if you're an oligarch, somebody like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, probably don't agree with Trump, but you think you might benefit from it if you support them, Apple, all the big corporations, then look how this turns out. Turn your gaze towards Russia, for example. So many oligarchs were empowered after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they were made rich by Putin, for example. Also Yeltsin, there was a lot of corruption. They probably thought that they would be billionaires and they'd have a sweet life. But just look how many of them have been wiped out. As soon as they're no longer useful, they're gone. It was the same for Hitler. And he was insane, right? And if you're one of the base, working class, many working class people, right? They love what Trump's doing. They don't like immigrants. They want a strong leader. Well, look at Russia. Who are the people being sent to the front line in Ukraine, right? There's 1,000 dying every day. They're not the elites. They're the working class people. The people who were sold this message, Russia is strong. We're the most powerful in the world. Nobody can defeat us. Ukraine is ours. Well, they're giving up their lives for that message. It's always the working class, the peasantry, who get the bad end of the deal. But eventually, this policy, arrogance, and aggression never works out. You find me an example in history where this has led to a positive outcome. Eventually, all empire will collapse and fade away. And in the end, there'll be nothing left but dust and old columns for archaeologists to inspect. Forget about building empire. What's important is how you act in the here and now. Whether you have altruism, compassion, whether you care about others' lives and their well-being. This is the only way we can build a better world. So the video's gotten a bit long, and I'll leave it at that. And until next time, see you later.